Hello and welcome back as we gather together for the third week in Lent. Today we read parables from the Underside, and we begin by reading Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Jesus told this parable to certain people who had convinced themselves that they were righteous and who looked on everyone else with disgust. Two people went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself with these words: God, I thank you that I'm not like everyone else, crooks, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of everything I receive. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He wouldn't even lift his eyes to look toward heaven. Rather, he struck his chest and said, God, show mercy to me, a sinner. I tell you, this person went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. I've always been more rock and roll than country. I grew up on the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But in the last few years, I found myself spending more time listening to country and Western music. The songs I love are those that tell a story that gets me thinking about the meaning of life. In the introduction, I mentioned Garth Brooks' Friends in Low Places. I love Glenn Campbell's final album, Adios, recorded after he had announced he had Alzheimer's. His longtime friend Carl Jackson had to stand next to him as he sang, feeding him the lyrics one line at a time because he couldn't remember them. It would be his farewell album, and the story of how he recorded it so touched me that I listened to the album hundreds of times by the time of his death in 2017. Recently, I was driving with my granddaughter listening to Jordan Davis and Luke Bryan singing about the advice of an 80-year-old man about making life count in their hit song, Buy Dirt. I began crying as I tried to explain to Stella why this song spoke to me. Jesus was a storyteller. His stories were called parables, and they were intended to teach his hearers about the meaning of life and faith, who God is and what he longs for from us. And, as we're about to see, so many of Jesus' parables spoke to and about outsiders, outcasts, and outlaws. There are 49 different parables recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. 9 appear in all 3 Gospels, 2 appear only in Mark, 8 appear only in Matthew, and 16 appear only in Luke. That's a lot of unique parables that Luke records on the lips of Jesus. I'm going to draw your attention to 3 of these 16 found only in Luke, and through them we'll see 2 more dimensions to Jesus' passion for lifting up the lowly. But first, a word about parables. The parables Jesus told were sometimes simple analogies or similes where he likens the kingdom of God to, for instance, a mustard seed in Luke chapter 13, verses 18 and 19. But often they are more detailed stories that ordinary people could relate to. Fictional stories illustrating some spiritual truth about God or faith or how we're meant to live. These stories were easy to remember. They came from everyday life, and they contained 1 or occasionally 2 or 3 spiritual truths. They often contrasted the life and heart that God intended with the life and heart of those who fail to get it, who fail to do God's will. Some were easy to understand, but a few left his hearers and still leave contemporary readers scratching their heads. An example of the perplexing parables is the parable of the dishonest manager in Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 9, of which there are no less than 4 interpretations, none of which make perfect sense, at least not to me. Perhaps this is why the parables were sometimes called riddles. As you read the parables, you'll notice that often Jesus has 2 or more contrasting characters or objects. 2 sons, 4 types of soil, a seed falls upon, a spiritually proud person, and one who is humble. A rich but indifferent man and a poor man who suffers at his gate. As you study the parables, always look to the context. What has just happened before the parable? What has Jesus just said? What have others just said? Who is Jesus speaking to? Once you are clear about the context, and Luke is great at giving the context so we don't miss the point, we can ask 2 questions. In what ways am I like each of the characters or objects in the parable? And 2, what does Jesus want me to know, think, or do in response to this parable? As we consider 3 of the most loved parables of Jesus found in only Luke's gospel, what I want you to notice is how each demonstrates Jesus' concern for humbling the proud while lifting up the lowly. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time.